direct road to Germany, and it was the path to victory. Anything apart from that was a distraction. It was going off chasing secondary objectives and a dispersion of effort. So he was all in for Germany and an invasion of Europe. He proposed 3 operations: Bolero, Sledgehammer, and Roundup. Bolero called for the buildup of U.S. forces in the United Kingdom. Sledgehammer was a plan to land 5 divisions in France in September 1942, ostensibly to be executed only if the Russian front collapsed. But its more ardent supporters wanted to go ahead and do it whatever the state of affairs were in the East. They wished to create what was called a lodgment, and that would be expanded in 1943 with Roundup landing 48 divisions in April of that month. Now for Britain, the war had been a series of almost uninterrupted disasters to this point. There was the fall of France. They were driven out of Greece and Crete. Rommel was running amok in North Africa. There was the utter humiliation of 3 German battleships running the English Channel in broad daylight in February, just before the meetings with FDR. Then in February 1942, Singapore surrendered. Churchill called that the greatest disaster in our history. Churchill said that. Churchill was a historian of some note, and he knew about Yorktown and many other great defeats the British had suffered, and he said that was their greatest one. Shortly thereafter, Burma was lost, and there were many who began to wonder if Britain could actually win this war. Churchill's strategy, as opposed to Marshall wanting to land in Europe as soon as possible, favored an attack on the periphery. That was the traditional British strategy, which had brought success against the Bourbons of France and Napoleon. And no doubt also Churchill had in mind the terrible casualties that the British had suffered in the First World War, and wasn't anxious to close with the Germans until they were weakened substantially. His proposal was that America should intervene in the Mediterranean, where Britain was already fighting. He proposed Operation Gymnast, the invasion of French North Africa. Well, the alliance endorsed Bolero, the buildup in England, not surprisingly, but recommended further analysis on Sledgehammer and Gymnast. In his book on the beginnings of World War II, The Hinge of Fate, Churchill tells us how wonderfully disingenuous Britain's sincerity was towards Roundup and Sledgehammer. This obfuscation created ill will and suspicion within the alliance. Again, coalition warfare, nobody exactly goes along with what the other guy wants. So FDR sent Marshall and Harry Hopkins to London in April 1942 for more discussions. Marshall was looking for a guarantee that if he couldn't get the British to agree to an invasion of the continent in 42, they would at least agree to one in 43. His argument was that superior Allied air power would maintain the lodgment on the continent while getting ready for the 48 divisions to follow up for Roundup. The British, on the other hand, said that the Germans already had enough forces in Europe to deal with the 5 divisions of Sledgehammer without moving a single battalion from Russia. And after similar disasters for the British in Norway, Dunkirk, Greece, another failure might well crush British morale and drive Churchill from office, putting the appeasers in his place and taking Britain out of the war. This was a very real possibility in English minds. Well, in May 1942, the Russian foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, visited London and Washington. He was demanding that the Allies get more involved and attack in attacking Germany. Russia had already suffered 5 million casualties, and the Allies only had a few tens of thousands of troops engaged fighting the Germans. It was a very real fear in the West that the Russians and the Germans would reach an agreement. They had done it in 1917. If so, then Russia would withdraw from the war, and all those millions of German troops fighting against Russia would go to the West. And if we could ever manage to dislodge them, it would be an extremely bloody fight to do so. Well, the British were non-committal to Molotov. They said, yeah, okay, well, we'll get back to you. But FDR released a statement that full understanding was reached with regard to the urgent task of creating a second front in Europe in 1942. It was a promise Britain had not agreed to and would not support. Churchill was worried FDR was getting off the rails, and so arranged for another conference in Washington in June of 1942. That was the second Washington conference. And during it, news arrived that Tobruk, which had heroically held out against the Germans in 1941, had fallen after only a few days of combat, with the surrender of 35,000 men, including the entire 2nd South African Division. Another terrible defeat. Could the British really fight this war? Churchill was visibly staggered by this. The British 8th Army, which had been fighting in Libya, now fell back to El Alamein, only 60 miles from Alexandria. Against the advice of most of his military, FDR ordered the U.S. forces stripped of 300 tanks and 100 cannon, all frontline equipment in short supply, and sent to the Middle East by fast convoy. Well, it was obvious that the British had no enthusiasm for France in 1942. And despite their protests, not much for 1943 either. Sledgehammer would be a preponderantly British operation, and so ultimately it was their decision. Churchill sent a message to FDR, I have found no one who regards Sledgehammer as possible. I should like to see you do gymnast as soon as possible. That meant North Africa. North Africa would be the only place where Americans could fight Germans in 1942. It wasn't quite FDR's promise to Stalin, but it was the best that could be done. And so FDR agreed to landings in North Africa against the advice of Marshall for one of the very few times he went against Marshall's advice during the whole war. After Dunkirk and Mers el-Kabir, it was not politic to put a British general in charge of the invasion of French North Africa. So Marshall chose Dwight David Eisenhower, making his debut on the world stage. Ike was born in 1890, born poor in Abilene, Kansas, and accepted to West Point. He graduated in the middle of his class in 1915, the class known as the one the stars fell on. He remained stateside training troops in World War I. He was promoted major in 1919 and stayed a major for 16 years, typical of Army stagnation at the time. Mostly a staff officer, his largest command was a battalion in the 1920s. Intelligent, hardworking, his potential surfaced when he graduated first of 245 men from the Command and General Staff College in 1926. In the 30s, he served under Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur in Washington, and again when MacArthur was a field marshal in the Philippine Army. The two men developed a certain antipathy for one another, exacerbated by conflict after the war when Ike was Chief of Staff and MacArthur Emperor of Japan. MacArthur derided Eisenhower as the best clerk I ever had. Ike responded, I studied dramatics under MacArthur for 7 years. Ike was brilliant in the big Louisiana maneuvers of 1941. His commanding officer recommended Colonel Eisenhower to Marshall for his broad vision, progressive ideas, and thorough grasp of the magnitude of the problems involved in handling an army. Lots of initiative and resourcefulness. Soon after Pearl Harbor, Ike was made head of the Plans Department in the War Office, meaning he worked directly with Marshall on the big issues, the biggest issues of the war. The Chief of Staff was so impressed, he sent him to London at the end of June 1942 to be U.S. Theater Commander. Now Marshall selected him to command Torch. It was a meteoric rise, going from colonel to four-star general in a year. His old friend George Patton said his initials, DD, stood for Divine Destiny. Ike, as a bit of an aside, Ike was one of the great smokers of all times. He usually lit one cigarette from another and had the appalling habit of dropping ashes and burning cigarette butts all over the furniture and carpet. While still a somewhat obscure Major General, he visited Bernard Montgomery's headquarters in England. Monty absolutely prohibited smoking anywhere around him and rudely told this new Yank, "I do not permit smoking in my headquarters," and forced him to stop. It was the first of many unpleasant encounters between the two men. Now, the political situation in French North Africa was extraordinarily complex. The quasi-independent Vichy government under Marshal Henry Patton, shown here talking to then ambassador to Vichy, France, Admiral Leahy, not an admiral at that time. At any rate, Vichy controlled unoccupied France, a colonial army, and a considerable French navy. Some of the members of this government enthusiastically supported the Germans, especially the French military. Especially in the French military, it was thought it was the legal obligation of those troops to support the de jure government of France, and that was Patton. These people regarded de Gaulle and his Free French as traitors. The Gaullists thought Patton a quisling. The two forces fought one another in Dakar, Madagascar, and Syria. De Gaulle, it was critical to the Allies that the French continue to exercise civil authority in North Africa. Otherwise, Allied forces would be consumed maintaining order amongst the hostile Arab populace over thousands of miles of territory. Consider our recent experience trying to do the same thing in various Arab countries. So Ike had neither the troops nor the desire for such a task. He hoped the French would welcome the Americans as the first step of their liberation, another example of nous sommes ici, Lafayette, which is what Pershing said when the Americans came ashore in France in 1917. We're here, Lafayette. But he needed a Frenchman with some stature to rally support. De Gaulle was disliked by FDR and didn't help his cause by adopting a hauteur out of all proportion to his actual strength. When he learned about Torch, he sent his chief of staff, not himself, his chief of staff, to see Eisenhower and demand that he be given charge of the operation. Ike said, "Thank you very much," and sent the man on his way. Instead, Eisenhower turned to this man, the heroic General Henri Giraud. He was taken prisoner in 1940, escaped, and was living privately in unoccupied France. Smuggled to Gibraltar by submarine, he showed de Gaulle had no monopoly on hauteur. He too demanded command of Torch. All Ike wanted was a nice radio announcement saying, "Please don't fight. The Allies coming over to our side." Instead, Giraud kept on about force levels and invasion locations and timing and so on and so forth. He was shuffled aside shortly after the landings. Well, the strategy for Torch was a three-pronged landing. The strategic objective, let's see if I can get this thing to work, was Tunis, not very well, Tunisia, and its port of Tunis. That was necessary to cut off the German supply lines, and isolate the battlefield. Isolating the battlefield is one of the great military principles, and it's one the United States seems to have ignored pretty much, since Korea. At any rate, that was the strategic objective, to get to Tunisia and cut off the Axis line of supply. The challenge was that the Italians and Germans were ensconced in Italy and Sicily, which was much, much closer, and so they could get there fairly quickly. So speed was of the essence. The British wanted the landings all to be within the Mediterranean and as far east as possible. But the Americans, having boldly advocated the invasion of Europe in 1942, now grew somewhat cautious when it came time for the rubber to hit the road, so to speak. Marshall wanted a secure western flank for several reasons, not the least of which was he wanted the port of Casablanca, a major port, for the huge supply and logistics that would follow the army into North Africa. He sent the Western Task Force under George Patton, 34,000 strong, and that landed on the Atlantic coast of French Morocco, November 8th, 1,000 miles from Tunis. Landings at that day also came in Algeria, which was still 500 miles from the target of Tunisia. Now, U.S. troops came ashore in Morocco at 3 locations, with all the snafus common in amphibious warfare, exacerbated by inexperience. Ships carrying the first assault wave for Port Lyautey didn't have enough landing craft aboard to actually transport the first wave. That meant other ships had to put their landing craft in the water and send them over to the proper ships. But unfortunately, the formation lost formation in the middle of the night. So the ships weren't where they were supposed to be. And in a new moon, coxswain were driving their craft around trying to find which ship is that? No, that's not the one we want. Well, let's go over here and look for that. It was a mess, in short. What happened was H-hour, the time for the landings, had to be postponed twice. Landings in Algeria were hours earlier, so surprise was lost. 2/3 of the infantry missed their assigned beaches, and many French felt honor-bound to fight, and combat was heavy. So, this is George Patton's debut in World War II. He had fought, of course, in France in World War I and was badly wounded there. Now, take a look at Patton. That's a magnificent uniform. And if you can see his shoes, it's a great shine he's got on those shoes. I was on an admiral's staff, Admiral House, as a matter of fact, and what impressed me, well, the admiral was a very impressive man, but the shine on his shoes was just perfect. He had a Philippine steward, and I think that was his main task. That's an exaggeration, but beautiful shine. And here's Patton, who was extremely strict or caring about his appearance and his uniform, and there he is in all his glory. Well, Patton crossed the Atlantic on the cruiser Augusta, flagship of Rear Admiral Kent Hewitt. He was delayed getting ashore on D-Day when the French Navy sortied, and Augusta, the rear turret on Augusta, opened fire, 8-inch guns, tremendous concussion coming out of them, and it knocked Patton's boat off the davits and into the water, where it promptly sunk. Luckily, it didn't have his famous pistols on him. He probably never let those get out of his sight. At any rate, he was late getting ashore, didn't get there until about 1300. But he was up before daylight the next day and went to the beach, where he found the situation a mess, with leadership negligent. The men were poor, the officers worse. Working in typical Patton style, he jumped into the water and shouted at some nearby soldiers, "Come back here. Yes, I mean you, all of you. Drop that stuff and come back here. Faster than that, goddammit, on the double." Waist deep in the water and with his shoulder against the bow of the landing craft, Patton showed them what he wanted. He yelled for them to wait for the next wave and lift and push. Now, push, goddammit, push. Don't you realize that boat has other trips to make? How do you expect to fight a war without ammunition? Now go and take that stuff to the dump, on the double. Coming across a scared soldier lying in the sand sobbing, he kicked him in the fanny with all my might. He jumped right up and went to work. Some way to boost morale, said Patton. I hit another man who was too lazy to push a boat. He worked on the beach tirelessly without food or water until returning to the Augusta that afternoon to confer with Hewitt. Some guy. That's a warrior. So this is the map for the Eastern Task Force, which came ashore at Algiers. It was 20,000 troops, British and American, and they sailed from Great Britain. They came ashore about 0100 on the 8th. But with the exception of the French Navy, there was only light resistance. By noon, the Allies were ashore, a ceasefire was arranged, and U.S. troops peacefully entered the town of Algiers. Iran was another matter. This was the Center Task Force, spearheaded by the Big Red One, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division. The commander of that division was Major General Terrible Terry Allen, a nickname he picked up at West Point, where his disdain for authority was renowned, and the description still applied. The 1st Ranger Battalion, commanded by the soon-to-be legendary Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, seized the small port of Arzew. You can see it up on your right, upper right. The port of Arzew, which was 25 miles east of Oran, leading the way for Allen's 16th and 18th Infantry Regiments, supported by tanks from the 1st Armored Division. The 26th Regiment, accompanied by General Theodore Roosevelt, the Assistant Division Commander, came ashore west of Oran. With little opposition, unloading was soon in full swing at all beaches. By nightfall, Allen had advanced 20 miles towards Oran, and Roosevelt had the 26th Infantry atop the hills of the Jebel Murdaj. The French Navy, with their bitter memories of Mers el-Kabir, fought. HMS Walney and HMS Heartland, carrying U.S. infantry landing parties, approached the harbor mouth 2 hours after the other landings. With supplies lost, a massacre ensued. Caught in French searchlights and under fire, Walney was raked at point blank range by the French sloop La Surprise. Other ships joined in, reducing it to a blazing hulk. Decks a shamble, she rolled over and sank early in the morning watch. Heartland was hit before she entered harbor, blasted by guns from the French destroyer Typhon. She dropped anchor on fire from stem to stern and blew up at daylight. Of 393 U.S. soldiers on the two ships, 189 were killed and 157 wounded, 90% casualty rate. Full of fight, French warships put to sea to attack Allied shipping, but were sunk and driven back by heavier Royal Navy vessels and planes from the American escort carrier Biter. The next day, the Big Red One overcame stiff resistance to continue the advance. Allied planes brought in from Gibraltar flew from newly seized airfields, breaking up French counterattacks. A general assault on Oran began the morning of D+2, accompanied by naval gunfire and air support. The city soon surrendered. Well, while all this was going on, Admiral Jean Darlan, on the left there, with Patton and Hermann Goering, was in Algeria visiting his son. It was an emergency visit. His son was dying of polio. After Patton, he was the legal head of the French government, and it so commanded the allegiance of Vichy troops throughout North Africa. By signing an armistice effective November 11th, he delivered the French cooperation Eisenhower so desperately wanted. However, the Darlan deal produced a firestorm. Frenchmen initially imprisoned for supporting the landings remained in prison, and the authorities continued the anti-Semitic practices of Vichy, all now with the de facto approval of Britain and the United States. Liberal opinion was outraged. When the time came, would the Allies support the other quisling governments of occupied Europe? By the way, that's Mark Clark, who was Eisenhower's second in command, Darlan in the middle, and the only man smiling there is Robert Murphy, who was FDR's representative to the Vichy government of North Africa. So unavoidably, a very great deal of Eisenhower's focus was on politics. Ike was not then a great operational commander, but he was becoming a great coalition commander, perhaps a rarer talent. Responsible to both London and Washington, Churchill and FDR communicated directly with him, and Eisenhower himself had to respond. You don't just shuffle off a message from the President of the United States to one of your underlings. He also had to respond to requests for information from the chiefs of staff of both the United States and Britain. The stress was enormous. He was never without a lit cigarette. But he showed his mettle by standing up to his masters. He wrote the combined chiefs of staff on November 14th that the idea of French affection for Americans would overpower their sense of loyalty to their legally constituted government or take orders from the figurehead Giraud was self-deceptive. The French stopped fighting because Darlan, their legitimate leader, told them to. They would obey no one else. No one, not on the ground, could appreciate the complex currents of feeling and prejudice that influenced this situation. FDR was very impressed by Ike's political acumen and masterfully diffused the situation by publicly declaring no one would decide the future of France but the French people themselves after they were liberated by the Allies. There was no binding agreement. Darlan bitterly said, FDR wishes to squeeze me like a lemon and throw me away when the juice is gone. Darlan was assassinated by a young French monarchist on Christmas Eve, no doubt to the relief of many. Well, back to a map of the North African theater. By December, 180,000 U.S. troops were in North Africa, but only 12,000 in Tunisia. Remember, Tunisia is where we're trying to get to isolate the battlefield and cut off Rommel. There, in Tunisia, were also 20,000 Brits and 30,000 ill-equipped Frenchmen. They formed the First Army under British Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson, facing 56,000 Axis troops with 3 German divisions, including the crack Hermann Goering Division and the 10th Panzers. The enemy also had local air superiority. If you've seen the movie Patton, one of the opening scenes with Patton is when they get strafed. The British local air commander is visiting him and they get strafed. Well, that was, I don't know if he was actually strafed or not, but that would be typical of the German air superiority in Tunisia at that time. Now, to capture, this one's a little complicated. You can see Tunis, upper right. To capture the vital port of Tunis, Anderson needed Jebel el Amara, called by the British Longstop Hill, and also the nearby Jebel el Rar. Both were clearly marked on Allied maps, and troops were there the previous month. Intelligence reported Longstop was held by a single company. In point of fact, 2 German battalions were in the area. 4 companies of the Coldstream Guards trekked 6 miles to attack shortly before midnight on December 23rd. After some sharp fighting, they took the crest and halted, awaiting relief by the 1st Battalion U.S. 18th Infantry, part of the Big Red One. The Guards ignored a counterattack that drove back their right flank as a cold rain fell. Critically, they failed to realize the tactical importance of the Jebel el-Rar. Rick Atkinson writes in An Army at Dawn, "Relief in combat is difficult for kindred units in daylight and fine weather. Between strangers of different nationalities at night in a downpour, the task is infinitely harder. The British guides either missed the Americans completely or were uncertain where they should go. The U.S. battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert York, lost his way, was pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. He eventually stumbled into the Coldstream command post while his staff was still wandering the night. And 800 of his infantrymen were scattered across the hills. At 4:30 a.m., their duty done as they defined it, the Coldstreams decamped in squelching boots, sleepless and hungry, and went back to their bivouac 6 miles away. Well, with dawn, the Americans realized their peril. Half the hillside was in enemy hands. Prisoners told Colonel York that rather than a handful of soldiers, a battalion of Panzer Grenadiers was on the hill with reinforcements en route. The ensuing German attack cut off and destroyed A Company on the right flank. Only 14 men escaped death or capture. Artillery and mortars raked the Yanks while supporting British artillery fire was sporadic and ineffective. By 1500, the Americans were barely clinging to the low reaches of the hills. The only reinforcements available were the Coldstream Guards. Imagine their indignation as they trudged in mud and rain over the 6 miles that twice hiked in the days past, and their contempt for the inept Yankees, unable to hold a position that was handed to them. The battle resumed on Christmas Eve with heavy casualties on both sides. At dawn Christmas Day, the German regimental commander, Colonel Rudolf Lang, led a company of tanks with artillery support in a desperate attack that drove in both flanks and forced the Allies to abandon Longstop. In 3 days' fighting, British casualties were 178. American losses were twice as much. The Guards Brigade after-action report read, excoriated the 18th Infantry. The plain facts are that the Americans did not retain possession of the key points and did not really make a major effort to get them back. They were unfitted and unprepared for the task. The British soldiers started calling the Americans our Italians. It was not meant as a compliment, although I would say as an aside that there were many Italian units that fought quite well during the war, but they had other problems. On hearing of the battle and the rebuke to his men, Terrible Terry Allen exploded. He had been forced to remain idle while his division was broken up and spread across Tunisia under British command. Just what Pershing tenaciously fought against in World War I. Many Americans bitterly criticized Ike for it. An extraordinarily pugnacious man, Allen stormed into the office of Beadle Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, and demanded permission to go to the front. A decorated combat veteran of World War I, Allen knew the nature of battle. After a thorough analysis, he concluded the British completely misused his men. He confronted the British Corps commander, Lieutenant General Charles Alfrey, with a written report, including harsh observations on British failures. Neglecting to properly guide the Americans to the front, lack of a proper turnover briefing, abandoning the Yanks in poorly prepared positions to figure out the situation in the dark, and deficient artillery support when the Germans struck. Alfrey was in a desperate position. If Allen presented his findings to Allied headquarters, the crisis would rock the coalition. Alfrey asked what he intended. Looking him in the eye, Allen tore the report in two, saying, "I hope this will be a lesson to the British High Command in how to deal with Americans. I expect that if I get any British troops under my command, I'll give them a lot better treatment than you have given my men." Well, British derision of American soldiers didn't begin or end at Long Stop. It was emblematic of coalition warfare. As the recipient of a cornucopia of aid from America, indebtedness bred contempt, and the British were masters of contempt. Harold Macmillan, Churchill's liaison or spy at Eisenhower's headquarters, described Americans as great big vulgar, vigorous but idle, with unspoiled virtues but corrupt. Condescension came naturally to such men and was often apparent even to vulgar and idle Yanks. Nowadays, common wisdom extols the need for allies, but history is not so conclusive. Alliances are intrinsically impervious to unified command, shot through with inherent friction as the parties pursue divergent national goals. Clemenceau, Premier of France at the end of World War I, said, "Since this war, my admiration for Napoleon has declined. He had only to fight coalitions." At dawn on December 23rd, following instructions direct from George Marshall to forget politics and focus on the battle in Tunisia, Eisenhower set off for the front in his armored Cadillac, a 300-mile trip through cold rain and the universal muck it made of primitive North African roads. On the way forward, he watched some soldiers struggle and fail to free a motorcycle from the mire, then need help in getting out themselves. He realized it was impossible to continue in such conditions and ended the offensive. Torch was over. It was a pivot point in the war against Germany. As Marshall foresaw, the coalition was now committed to the Mediterranean, and the next stop would be Sicily. It proved impossible to undertake the invasion of France before 1944. Britain's peripheral strategy would prevail at least until then. Thank you. Questions?
We will begin taking questions now from both our in-person and online audience. So if you're here in person, just raise your hand. I'll bring the mic over to you. If you're watching on Facebook, feel free to leave your question as a comment. If you're watching on Vimeo, feel free to place your question within the chat, and we'll make sure to get to everyone's questions. So.
Hi, so on the trip through Algeria, did the coalition forces find any issues with pro-Algerian nationalists and having them attack their convoys?
Not that I know of. So far as I know, the French kept that well in order. They've been doing it for, 80-odd years, and knew who the troublemakers were.
So there was much finger wagging when the Axis were able to get out of Tunis. And was there anyone to blame that they didn't shut them off, or could it have in fact been done? Then there was they got out of Sicily, and we seem to keep missing them.
Well, actually, Tony, they didn't get out of Tunisia. Hitler had given them instructions to fight, and about 250,000 men surrendered. As big a surrender as Stalingrad, as big a loss of men as Stalingrad. You're correct about Sicily, where George Patton was the only man with any sense of urgency about cutting off the Germans in Sicily. And I believe I'm going to be talking about that here next year, so you should come to that too. But in terms of Tunisia, Hitler did the job for us, and he didn't let them retreat, so we got them all.
But some did get to Sicily, though.
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, maybe a few stragglers and so forth, but no major units got out of Tunisia. The Hermann Goering, which fought in Sicily, was a new unit. They reconstituted it. It hadn't existed, and it's the end of the 10th Panzer. as well as the Africa Corps, which had gotten to Tunisia by that time, fighting a withdrawal against Montgomery.
Rick, didn't Major General Allen and Roosevelt both get relieved as a result of what happened in North Africa?
Yeah, this happens a little while later, during the fighting for Tunisia. Allen's story, and I give it some credence, is that Omar Bradley hated him and was determined to get him relieved, and did so. However, Patton stood up for him, as did Marshall, and Patton insisted that the relief be done without prejudice. And both men fought later in the war. As you probably know, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. came ashore with, 4th Infantry? 4th Infantry Division, and got the Medal of Honor for his action at D-Day, dying shortly thereafter of a heart attack. Patton called him the bravest man he ever knew. Allen also returned to the European theater, as I forget which division he had command of. But they were both worn out. I mean, they should have been relieved, not for cause, not for the prejudice of Omar Bradley, a remarkably prejudiced man, but just because they were burned out. So it was probably the best, for the best.
So, in your opinion, which out of the three task forces, the Central, Western, and Eastern task forces that landed in North Africa, was the most vital to the North African campaign?
Oh, boy. Well, geez, I don't know how it's kind of hard to separate them. Patton remained in Morocco training troops until after the disaster of the Kasserine Pass, and then came and more or less took command of American troops in Tunisia. But wow, I would think it would be the Eastern Task Force, because they were the closest to Tunisia. But it was the Tunisian campaign was remarkably start and stop. It took them, gosh, I want to say it was March or April before they finally got the Germans to surrender. And by that time, Montgomery had crossed North Africa very slowly to come up from the southern Tunisia. But I guess I can't really say which one was most important in the fighting. Allen's Big Red One fought wonderfully in Tunisia. And they were in the Eastern Task Force, I believe. Unless, was it the Central Task Force? If you're interested, though, you could read An Army at Dawn. It's about that thick, but it's very entertaining.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Rick, for everything.
My
I
pleasure.
want to thank our in-person audience for being here today, our online audience for tuning in. If you enjoy our programming, from lectures to ceremonies, you name it, you can find out more information on our website. I do want to let our audience know that next month's December Lunchbox lecture will not be on the first Wednesday of the month, because it's at the exact same time as our Pearl Harbor commemoration. And I haven't figured out how to be in two places at once yet. So we will be having our December Lunchbox lecture on Wednesday, December 14th. So stay tuned to our website for lots of other programming coming up. And I want to thank each and every one of you again, our sponsors, AARP Louisiana. Take care, and we look forward to seeing you next time here at the National World War II Museum. Good deal. Thank you, Rick.
You're welcome. Let's see,